When I name the country China, the first thing that comes to mind is probably made in China, or their manufacturing, or maybe even Chinese food. Although manufacturing is huge in China, there is much more to China than just manufacturing. One thing that may get overlooked is the roles that each gender has played throughout history and today, as well as more specifically, the role that women have played. In high school, I did a project on China's Industrial Revolution, and therefore learning more about China's culture, such as women's roles, has really intrigued me. Today, I will be talking about the history of women's roles, as well as the present day roles, and how China's gender culture compares to our own here in the United States. I'm first going to give you a history of women's roles in China, so that the present will be a little clearer. Historically, women did not enjoy the same status as men, either politically or socially. They were not treated well. They were socially segregated and had to compete with mistresses. One example of this is the immobilizing foot binding. Although women were not treated well, they did excel in 4 areas, such as fidelity, cautious speech, industriousness, and graceful manners. A male child would grow up to contribute financially to the family, perform rituals such as ancestor worship, and they would perpetuate the family name. Female childs, not so much. Arranged marriages were very common in the history of China. But they weren't about love. They were about economic and social status. Upper class women, their lives were strictly controlled. They were given very little freedoms and lots of responsibilities. One of these responsibilities would be monitoring the finances. And just because they monitored the finances, they still weren't the head of the household. Now, a woman listened to her father's wishes until she was married. She religiously obeyed her husband until he would die. Now, if she lived longer than him, she would then spend the rest of her life catering to her son's demands. Now that I have told you a little bit about the history of women's roles versus men's roles in China, let's take a look at a more present model of their role. In urban China, there's a very, very liberal mindset. Men and women receive the same rights and benefits, but there is still a little bit of inequality. One way we can see this is if a couple has a daughter and a son, they would teach the son to toughen up, and they would console the daughter if they were both crying. Now, rural China, on the other hand, they would rather have a boy. They are much closer to the historical views on gender roles, and their mothers always tell them to marry well. Women's roles have changed, especially in present day. One big area of this is the professional atmosphere. Media does amplify the gender inequality, and there are many smart women and successful women that are professionals in the workplace. China's opening to outside influences have greatly improved the inequality. One example of this is the digital communication industry. It's common to see women in leadership roles in that industry. Now, there was a study conducted by Professor McGinnis at Chinese University of Hong Kong Business School, which shows there's a direct correlation between private companies and increased recruitment of women employees. Here's some statistics to prove that the equality gap is closing. Of graduates, 47% of the working population is women. 72% of that 47% say they would like to pursue a C-level executive position, such as CEO or COO. Now, in 2010, there was 137 million working women, which was 42.6% of the workforce, compared to the 7.5% of the workforce in 1949. The number of female lawmakers is 22%. The number of women in senior management is over half, at 51%. Now that I have explored the present-day China gender roles, let's compare the struggles that they have as well as our own struggles here in the United States. Here's a brief history of women's roles in the United States. I'll just kind of read off a timeline here. In 1939, women gained the right in the first state to own property in their name with permission of their husband. In 1869, there was the first woman lawyer. In 1900, every state passed legislation allowing women the right to keep their own property as well as their wages. In 1920, it guaranteed the women the right to vote. In 1963 was the Equal Pay Act, which guaranteed equitable pay. Now, jumping forward to the not so distant past, in 2013, the ban against women in the military combat positions was removed, which overturned the 1994 Pentagon decision, which restricted women from combat roles. Now let's do some statistics that compare to China's as well as our own. The number of female lawmakers in China, like I said before, was 22%. Here in the United States, it's only 17%. And on top of that, the United Nations Development Program, the Human Development Report of 2010, gave China a gender equality ranking of 38. That's just below the US at 37. Now that I have told you a brief overview of women's struggles in the United States, as well as how they compare to women's struggles in China, let me leave you with a few thoughts. After talking to you about the historical and current roles of women in China, as well as comparing the struggle for equality in China to that in the US, I hope you have a better understanding. Although many people may think that China still has a large gap in inequality, or that women hold a much inferior role in society, it is improving. And over time, the struggle for equality will be over, and men and women will have the same treatment.